Just a temp. That's what the nursing agency called her on the phone. Just a temp nurse, no permanence, no questions asked, perfect for the night shifts that nobody else wanted. Rachel Torres had accepted the position at Oak Creek Memorial in Raleigh because the fluorescent corridors between 2300 and 0700 hours were a kind of invisibility she could live inside. Nobody asked the night shift nurses about their lives. Nobody asked where they came from or why their hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who had learned to work in the dark, in confined spaces, under pressure that could kill you if you hesitated. She had been a senior chief petty officer for 20 years. She had pulled wounded sailors from firefights in Helmand Province with shrapnel still singing through the air around her head. She had held a young child's abdomen together with her hands while medevac rotors screamed overhead. Then the PTSD had started making her hands shake during surgical procedures back at Naval Station San Diego, and she had walked away from the uniform, from the identity, from everything, and taken a job that required her to be invisible. The parking lot at Oak Creek Memorial was empty except for staff cars when she arrived at 2,245 hours. October rain hammered the asphalt in sheets, and Rachel moved through it without hesitation, her scrubs clinging to her ribs, her sneakers silent on the wet concrete. She had dressed deliberately for this work, no jewelry, no military insignia, nothing that could mark her as anything but ordinary. The only thing she carried was a battered mug from a base exchange that had closed in 2009, the coffee inside still hot enough to steam against her face when she drank it. The mug had a faded logo from Camp Lejeune and the words "Always Faithful" printed in navy blue. She kept it because she couldn't bring herself to throw it away, the way some people keep photos of the dead. The ER doors opened automatically, and the smell hit her first, antiseptic layered over something older, something underneath that was part blood, part human suffering, part the industrial cleaners they used to scrub the tile floors at midnight. Rachel moved through triage without making eye contact with anyone. The night shift nurses knew her as the quiet one, the one who didn't ask to switch shifts or complain about staffing levels. She clocked in at 2,300 hours exactly, collected her assignment sheet, and headed toward the patient floors. On her way, she touched the inside of her jacket, feeling the small rectangle of faded cloth sewn into the lining. A unit patch from Helmand Province. She touched it every shift like a prayer, the way monks touch prayer beads. Nobody knew it was there. Nobody knew what it meant. That was exactly how she wanted it. Room for 47 was at the end of the corridor on the 4th floor, past the nurse's station where the fluorescent lights buzzed with a sound like electricity trapped in glass. Inside, a man lay motionless beneath white sheets, a paralyzed Navy SEAL named Michael Chen, 34 years old, paralyzed from the T6 vertebra down after a rooftop fall during a training exercise in San Diego. His file was thick, nearly 4 inches of paper, each page a doctor's assessment, each assessment more hopeless than the last. Rachel pulled up a chair and read through the entire chart systematically, her eyes moving with the speed of someone trained to absorb tactical information in seconds. 5 minutes. That's all she needed to understand the full landscape of his abandonment. The first assessment came from Dr. Richard Sterling, the chief neurologist, dated 6 weeks ago. Case too complex for standard rehabilitation protocols. Recommend comfort care consultation. The second came from Dr. James Conrad, orthopedic surgery. Prognosis prohibitive. Not a surgical candidate. The third, fourth, fifth assessments all followed the pattern like some kind of reverse liturgy, each doctor adding his own version of not viable, not appropriate for our services, recommend transfer to long-term care facility. Rachel kept reading. The 6th doctor had written, patient deteriorating. Recommend hospice evaluation. The 7th had simply written, decline to treat. Then came the 8th, 9th, 10th. By the time she reached the 15th assessment, Rachel understood what had happened. 15 different doctors. 15 refusals. 15 ways of saying the man lying in the bed had already been decided dead by people whose job was to fight against death. She set the chart down gently and approached the bedside. Michael Chen was awake, his eyes following the movement of the 4 stand as she checked the fluid levels. His breathing was shallow but steady, the ventilator beside him unplugged and silent. he was breathing on his own, which none of the doctors had apparently noticed to mention. She placed the stethoscope against his chest at the 5th intercostal space, mid-axillary line, and listened. There. A faint but audible pericardial friction rub, a sound like leather brushing cloth, the specific sound of the pericardium, the sac around the heart, inflaming. The day shift had missed it. The day shift, who had spent maybe 4 minutes total with this patient before deciding he wasn't worth their time. "I'm going to listen to your heart," Rachel said, speaking quietly, her voice the kind that soldiers develop after years of giving orders in spaces where sound carries too far. "You're going to be fine." She had no idea if that was true. She had no idea if any of them were going to be fine. But she had learned in Helmand Province that what you say in the first 60 seconds after making contact with someone who is terrified becomes the architecture of their survival. Your voice is the first medicine. She completed her assessment methodically, blood pressure, temperature, O2 saturation, all documented with a kind of precision that made the nurses on day shift seem almost careless. Every number went into her charting. Every detail. Every observation that shouldn't have been missed. By 0300 hours, Rachel had finished her rounds and settled into the break room with her coffee and the monitor on the adjacent wall that showed cardiac vitals for every monitored patient on the floor. The mug felt warm in her hands, and she stared into the dark liquid, not really seeing it. The nurse who came in was named Donna, a day shift nurse who sometimes picked up nights to make extra money. "You following Chen in 447? Donna asked, and Rachel nodded. "That's a waste of your time," Donna said, and the words came out casual, the way people talk about weather. "He's already gone. Everyone knows it. Orders are comfort care at this point. Just let him go." The words were delivered without malice. That was what made them land so hard. Donna believed she was being kind, offering Rachel advice about how to stop caring. Rachel did not respond. She had learned early in her career that silence was a weapon. Silence gave you space to think. Silence made other people uncomfortable in ways that speech never could. She finished her coffee and set the mug down on the table with a soft ceramic click that sounded like a bullet chambering in the quiet break room. Donna left, uncomfortable, and Rachel was alone again with the fluorescent hum and the distant sound of the ventilators breathing for people who couldn't breathe for themselves. The charting continued all night, meticulous and precise. Every shift, every patient, every observation documented in language so clear and so specific that it created a paper trail, a map of what had been missed, of which doctors had looked at which patients and decided not to try. Rachel didn't know yet that this precision would become a weapon. She didn't know that every careful notation, every time-stamped observation, every cross-referenced detail was being noticed by someone else. She only knew that these were her people, the wounded, the abandoned, the ones that everybody else had stopped fighting for. She knew how to fight for them. It was the one thing her 20 years had taught her. At 0515 hours, Dr. Hargrove appeared on the 4th floor, moving through the corridors with the kind of physical presence that made people step aside without being asked. He was 53 years old, with the kind of jawline that could cut glass and hands that had never been dirty. His shoes were Italian leather, the kind that cost more than most nurses made in a month. His watch was a Rolex, $40,000 of gold and precision. He was the chief of surgery at Oak Creek Memorial, and he had built something underneath his legitimate practice, something that required careful attention, something that required people to not ask too many questions. He walked past Rachel in the corridor without acknowledging her, which was fine. But then he paused. Then he turned around. "Show me your charting on that Chen case," he said, and it wasn't a request. It was the kind of command that comes from someone used to being obeyed. Rachel pulled up the file on the nearest computer terminal, and Hargrove leaned in, reading. His eyes moved across the screen with the speed of someone who understood what he was looking at, and what he was looking at made his jaw tighten. He saw the meticulous documentation. He saw the precise timestamps. He saw the way each observation was cross-referenced with lab values and imaging reports. He saw, in other words, the kind of charting that would hold up under scrutiny. The kind of charting that made it very difficult for other people's mistakes, or other people's fraud, to hide in plain sight. He saw the faded unit patch that Rachel had tucked back inside her jacket when she had sat down. He didn't know what it meant. He couldn't have known. But he saw it, and something about the way she carried herself made him suspicious of exactly who she was pretending to be. "Interesting," he said quietly, and the word came out like a threat. "Thorough night shift work." He didn't smile. The absence of a smile was somehow worse. Then he walked away, and Rachel watched him go, her hands perfectly still, her breathing steady as a metronome. But he didn't go to the nurse's station. He didn't go back to his office. He went to room for 47, and he stood in the doorway looking at Michael Chen, paralyzed and abandoned, lying in a hospital bed while the rain continued to hammer against the windows outside. But that wasn't the worst part. By 06:15 hours, when Rachel's shift was ending and she was preparing to leave, Dr. Hargrove was sitting in his office on the 15th floor, the door closed, the lights dimmed to just the glow of his computer screen and a brass lamp on his desk shaped like a sculpture of a man with his chest open. He was dialing a number on his personal phone, a phone that had an encrypted line, a phone that he used for conversations that needed to be private. On the other end, someone answered immediately. "We have a problem," Hargrove said quietly, and his voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, all controlled power waiting to be released. "There's a new night shift nurse here. Started last week. Something's wrong with her. She's charting too carefully. She's asking questions about the Chen case. I think we need to find out who she really is." The morning round started like every other morning at Oak Creek Memorial, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical song, the smell of antiseptic mixing with stale coffee from the nurse's station, the soft beep of 100 monitors keeping time like a city's heartbeat. Rachel moved through the corridors with the precision she'd learned in field hospitals, her eyes cataloging every detail, vital signs, medication schedules, the small signs that separated stable from catastrophic. Room for 47 held a Navy SEAL, paralyzed from a roadside explosion in Kandahar 3 weeks ago. 15 different doctors had evaluated him. 15 had walked away. The chart was a graveyard of refusals. Dr. Chen, neurosurgery, prognosis too poor for operative intervention. Dr. Patel, orthopedic, case complexity exceeds current capacity. Dr. Morrison, spine surgery, not viable for rehabilitation, recommend comfort measures. 15 names. 15 different reasons that meant the same thing: he wasn't worth saving. Rachel had read the imaging files herself during her night shifts, the MRI scans, the CT reconstructions, the electrodiagnostic studies. She'd held the films up to the monitor light in the empty radiology room and seen what the other doctors hadn't bothered to see: a spinal cord with post-traumatic syrinx but intact gray matter at T10 T12. Salvageable. Repairable. Possible. She documented everything in meticulous military handwriting. The findings. The refusals. The dates and times. The kind of charting that left no room for interpretation, no space for negligence to hide. It was the same habit that had kept her alive in Helmand Province: precision, attention, the understanding that small details were the difference between living and dying. During morning rounds, Dr. Hargrove swept through the unit with the confidence of a man who had never been questioned. He was 57, silver-haired, the kind of surgeon who billed phantom consultations and inflated procedure codes with the same ease that other men breathed. His power was institutional, accumulated through years of strategic favors and the kind of quiet understanding that built networks of protection. The hospital board chairman owed him a consulting contract. The chief of medicine owed him cover on 3 malpractice settlements. The medical school friends in quality assurance owed him favors from residency programs. He was a man built from IOUs and consequences. Rachel approached him outside room for 47 with her request form, a formal written opinion asking for a single surgeon to review the SEAL's case, to look at the scans with fresh eyes, to consider the possibility that 15 negative opinions weren't fact but rather 15 individual decisions to look away. Her voice was quiet, deferential. The voice of someone used to having their words dismissed. "Dr. Hargrove, I've reviewed the imaging on our patient in 447, and I believe there may be surgical options that haven't been fully explored. I'd like to request a second opinion from neurotrauma. Someone from outside the hospital, if possible. Hargrove took the form without slowing his pace. He read 3 words and his jaw tightened. Then he changed direction, heading straight for room 447, Rachel following half a step behind like she was supposed to be invisible. The SEAL's mother and father sat in visitor chairs, both in their 70s, their hands clasped together like that small contact was the only thing keeping them tethered to hope. They'd been keeping vigil for 22 days. The door swung open. Hargrove held up the request form as if it were infected material. Ms. Torres, or should I say nurse night shift, since you seem to prefer working when real doctors aren't around, do you have a medical degree I'm unaware of? Are you board certified in neurosurgery? No? Then perhaps you should stick to emptying bedpans and leave diagnosis to those of us who actually went to medical school. His voice had the texture of a man used to being obeyed, a tank idling in a garage, all controlled power and the threat of what happened if anyone tried to get in his way. The mother flinched. The father's grip on her hand tightened. Rachel took one measured breath. She did not look away. She did not let her shoulders round. She met his eyes with the same flat stare she'd learned watching officers make impossible decisions, the stare that said she understood the weight of his position and was not impressed by it. A single tear traced her cheek, coming from nowhere, from everywhere, from 15 years of watching people decide who was worth saving. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. I've seen what happens when good people look away from someone who needs help. The silence in the room was absolute. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The ventilator wheezed. The rain outside the window hammered against the glass like it wanted in. Hargrove's face went white at the edges. He turned and left without another word, the request form crumpled in his fist. By shift change, a formal write-up appeared on the unit board in the hallway, visible to every nurse, every resident, every hospital employee who passed through the corridor. The lettering was pristine, printed from an official template, the kind of document that meant investigations and files and the slow bureaucratic machinery of institutional power grinding toward a single conclusion: Rachel Torres was a problem to be eliminated. Disciplinary action, R. Torres. Insubordination and unauthorized medical recommendations. Under investigation. The message was loud enough that by 2,100 hours, every nurse on the unit had received the subtext through the invisible network of hospital whispers. Hargrove had called the nursing director. Hargrove had mentioned standards. Hargrove had made it clear that the temp from the agency was a liability, that her opinions were unwelcome, that associating with her was not a smart career move. Rachel entered the break room at 0200 hours with her lunch in a brown paper bag from home. 4 nurses sat at the table: Sarah from pediatrics, Monica from ICU, Jenny from MedSurg, and Dev from the night supervisor's desk. They had all chatted with her before, small hospital talk, weather and schedules and the shared exhaustion of the night shift. Sarah glanced at the others. A message passed between them in that glance, wordless and ancient as pack dynamics. Sarah stood. Monica picked up her juice box. Jenny grabbed her phone. Dev collected her water bottle. Within 30 seconds, Rachel sat alone at the table, her untouched sandwich in front of her, the fluorescent lights humming their relentless song. The sound of their footsteps echoed down the hallway. One of them laughed nervously. They didn't look back. Rachel sat with her hands flat on the table, the tremor coming now, the PTSD shake she'd spent 3 years learning to suppress. The tremble that had haunted her for so long that she'd left the Navy to escape it, to find a place where her hands could be steady, where she could work in the dark and no one would ask questions about why a senior chief petty officer was working night shifts in scrubs, why she flinched at certain sounds, why she sometimes woke up at 0300 seeing villages that didn't exist on American maps. Her knuckles went white as she gripped the edge of the table, using the physical pressure to override the neural misfiring, the body memory that couldn't tell the difference between a hospital and a Helmand Province field station. The charge nurse delivered the final message at the nursing station, loud enough for others to hear, the kind of professional courtesy that was actually a knife. Dr. Hargrove wants you to know that he's contacted your placement agency. He says temps who overstep their qualifications don't last long in hospitals with standards. Rachel's hands released the counter. She picked up her brown paper bag from the break room. She pulled on her jacket and felt the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the one she'd kept hidden for 3 years, the one she'd carried like a scar that refused to heal. She touched it once, the way soldiers touch medals they've earned but refuse to wear. What happened next was the sound of Hargrove's office door closing. What happened next was the glow of his computer screen at 0230 hours, after the phone call came from the night supervisor, the one who'd noticed the charge nurse standing alone at the nursing station, taking instruction from the chief of surgery about which temp nurses to isolate. What happened next was Hargrove reaching for his phone with the practiced ease of a man who had learned how to leverage every relationship he'd ever built. The monitors registered the distress before Rachel saw it. Oxygen saturation climbing steady at 97%, heart rate holding at 88, blood pressure 118/71, all the numbers a nurse watches like a parent counts a child's breaths. But at 02 for 5 hours, standing in the doorway of room for 47, Rachel saw what the machines hadn't learned to announce yet. The SEAL's neck veins distended like cords beneath paper-thin skin. His breathing shallow. That peculiar stillness that comes just before the body decides to stop cooperating. She moved without thinking. Thinking was for people who had time. The pericardial sac, the membrane surrounding the heart, had filled with fluid. Beck's triad, distended jugular veins, muffled heart sounds, hypertension creeping downward like a thermometer in a dying room. 15 doctors had refused this patient. 15. Not because they lacked the skill but because they lacked the will, and Rachel had watched every refusal settle into the chart like sediment. Now the payment was due. The body always collects. "Hey, buddy. Look at me." Her voice the same steady pitch she'd used in Helmand Province when shrapnel had turned a patrol base into a geometry of blood and screaming. "You're doing fine. Just need to help your heart breathe for a minute." She didn't wait for permission. Permission was a luxury for people who followed protocols instead of saving lives. Rachel grabbed a spinal needle from the sterile field, 22 gauge, the kind meant for anesthesia blocks, and a 10 milliliter syringe. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of mechanical wasps. She could hear the ventilator's rhythmic wheeze, the monitor's electronic pulse, her own breathing, steady, measured, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world can throw at a person. She prepped the skin with chlorhexidine, a cold spiral of antiseptic that smelled like surgery and necessity. The needle went in at the 5th intercostal space, aimed toward the left shoulder blade, angled upward at 45 degrees toward the patient's heart. Muscle memory took over. Hands that had held lives together in field hospitals under mortar fire didn't tremble. They didn't hesitate. They remembered everything their owner had tried to forget. There. The needle breached the pericardium with a sensation like pushing through silk. Rachel's fingers felt it immediately, that subtle give, that boundary between what's protected and what's exposed. She withdrew the plunger. Blood. Dark, unhealthy, pooled in the syringe like evidence. She pulled 5 milliliters. Then 10. Then 15. Each draw made the SEAL's breathing easier, less labored, as if someone had loosened a fist around his chest. The oxygen saturation climbed, from 91 to 94 to 96. The blood pressure rose from the dangerous decline, 98/60, then 105/65, then stabilizing at 112/72. The heart rate dropped from the frantic 118 down to 94, the rhythm finding its way back to something resembling normal. Sinus rhythm. She removed the needle. Applied pressure to the puncture site with sterile gauze. Her movements contained the precise economy of someone who had learned long ago that hesitation kills. Nothing wasted. Nothing uncertain. The kind of motion that looks like ballet to people who don't understand that every degree of angle matters when you're working between a man's ribs. All done. She disposed of the needle into the sharps container, the small metallic clink barely audible beneath the monitor's steady beep. Your heart's got plenty of room to work now. The SEAL's eyes fluttered open. He was still paralyzed from the neck down, the medication they'd given him during intubation hadn't worn off yet, but his pupils tracked her movement. Recognition flickered there. Something deeper than the casual acknowledgement a patient gives any nurse. She saw him try to speak, muscles straining against pharmaceutical paralysis, and she placed one hand on his shoulder. Shush. Let the machine help you breathe. Don't fight it. She documented everything with a meticulous precision that had made her dangerous. Time of intervention, 0247 hours. Procedure, emergency pericardiocentesis to relieve cardiac tamponade secondary to fluid accumulation. Needle type, 22-gauge spinal needle. Fluid volume, 42 milliliters of sanguineous fluid. Patient tolerance, good. Vital signs post-procedure, stable and improving. O2 sat 97%. Heart rate 88. Blood pressure 112/72. Sinus rhythm maintained. No complications. No adverse events. Clear, detailed, the kind of charting that leaves no room for ambiguity or denial. The kind of charting that proves 15 physicians were wrong. The kind of charting that proves they didn't just lack the time, they lacked the courage. Or something worse than cowardice. Something that looked like professional judgment but smelled like something else entirely. Rachel had spent 2 decades learning to read the difference between a legitimate medical contraindication and a physician too comfortable to care. She was still adjusting the seals for line, still in the quiet work of post-crisis stabilization, when Hargrove arrived at 03 for 5 hours. He came through the ICU doors like a man summoned by invisible threads, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who'd received a very specific phone call from someone very important. Full surgical scrubs. Surgical cap. Shoe covers. All the costumes of authority, though he wasn't scheduled for surgery. Wasn't on call. Shouldn't have been in the hospital at all. His eyes found the chart before they found her. She watched his face as he read her notes, watched the color drain from his cheekbones like someone had pulled a plug. His hand trembled as he held the clipboard. Just slightly. Just enough that if you weren't trained to notice small changes in human physiology, you'd miss it. He pulled the charge nurse aside outside room for 47. Rachel could hear the conversation from inside, the sound carrying through the open door with the clarity of words that weren't meant to be private but didn't expect to be overheard. Who authorized this nurse to perform invasive procedures? Hargrove's voice had changed. The confident drawl replaced by something clipped and dangerous. Check her credentials. I want every license verification, every reference, every employment record from the past 5 years. Call the staffing agency. I want to know who vetted her. But that wasn't the worst part. The consultant arrived by 0600 hours, a thin man with wire glasses who moved like an accountant, all efficiency and joyless precision. He spread Rachel's personnel file across the conference table in the administrator's office like a forensic pathologist examining a body. Rachel caught glimpses of it during a supply run, her nursing license, her BLS certification, her references. All current. All valid. All adequate but unremarkable. She'd been careful about that. 20 years of excellence reduced to meet requirements and satisfactory performance. The opposite of standing out. She's a ghost, the consultant said, and Rachel heard it because she was standing at the medication cart, listening to the conversation drift through the open door like contamination. Adequate background, but nothing remarkable. Almost like she's trying to be invisible. Hargrove laughed. A sound like a knife being drawn. Invisible. Of course she is. The termination paperwork moved through the hospital bureaucracy with the speed of institutional certainty. By 0800 hours, the hospital administrator, a man named Benedict who golfed with Hargrove on Saturday mornings and maintained the kind of professional blindness that comes from not wanting to see, signed the termination order. Termination for cause. Performing procedures beyond scope of practice. Failure to follow chain of command. Creating liability exposure. Creating a paper trail. Creating a problem. Rachel's badge was deactivated in the system at 08 for 7 hours while she was still in room for 47, adjusting the seals for fluids, monitoring his oxygen levels, documenting his post-procedure stability. She didn't know yet. The badge would still work until security tried to use it, until that moment came when the access door wouldn't open and the red light would flash and everything would change. Boots on tile. The security officers, 2 of them, walking with the embarrassed reluctance of people asked to do a job nobody likes, appeared at the ICU entrance at 0903 hours. One of them carried a cardboard box, the kind hospitals used for belongings. The kind that took a person's dignity and reduced it to cargo. Rachel saw them coming. She always saw things coming. It was the thing that made her dangerous to men like Hargrove. She finished the for adjustment. Noted the fluids on the chart. Checked the monitor one final time, all the numbers holding steady, all the vital signs cooperating, the SEAL's heart beating at the rhythm of survival because she'd remembered something 15 other doctors had forgotten. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is act before you're given permission. Then she stood up, turned, and met their eyes with the calm of someone who understood that nothing they were about to do could touch the things she'd already endured. Hargrove moved fast. The kind of fast that betrays panic disguised as authority. By 0400, while Rachel was still in room for 47 monitoring the SEAL's stabilizing vital signs, her phone buzzed against her thigh. A text from the nursing agency, call immediately. She didn't. By 0530, an email arrived on the hospital system marked urgent and copied to 7 people she'd never met. She read it once, understood it completely, and set the phone face down on the break room table. The words didn't change. The accusations didn't soften. Unauthorized medical procedures. Scope of practice violations. Liability exposure. Each phrase was a blade, and Hargrove had sharpened them all. At 0547, the board chairman's home phone rang. Hargrove's voice on the other end was buttersmooth, the tone of a man who'd rehearsed this exact speech 100 times in his head. We have a situation. Night shift nurse performed an advanced procedure without physician supervision. Pericardiocentesis. The SEAL patient in for 47. She stabilized him, yes, but the liability is catastrophic. Our malpractice carrier will crucify us. He paused, let that settle. I'm recommending immediate termination and notification to the state board. We need to act before her lawyers do. The chairman, groggy and irritated at being called before dawn, didn't argue. Hargrove's track record was impeccable. His reputation was solid gold. Why would he lie? 23 minutes later, a call went to the nursing agency placement office. Hargrove didn't use his own phone. He had his administrative assistant make it, a woman who'd worked for him 12 years and never asked questions. Ms. Torres's contract is terminated effective immediately. She is not to return to Oak Creek Memorial. Yes, we'll be filing a report with the state licensing board. The agency placement director started to ask why, but Hargrove's assistant had already disconnected. By 0615, the agency had sent Rachel a termination notice via hospital email. She read it in the supply closet where she'd gone to restock the crash cart, her hands perfectly steady as she scrolled through the legalese. The tremor wasn't fear. It was restraint. Then came the consultant. Hargrove had called in a favor from medical school, a man named Dr. Sterling Pierce who ran a quality assurance consulting firm that specialized in salvaging hospitals from potential litigation. Pierce owed Hargrove money, the kind of debt that didn't have a repayment schedule. It was a permanent obligation. By 0630, Pierce was on a call with the hospital administrator, speaking with the authority of someone who'd never met Rachel Torres and didn't intend to. From a risk management perspective, immediate action is the only option. A temporary nurse performing permanent procedures? That's not a gray area. That's a violation. Document everything, separate her from patient care, and process the termination before she can file a grievance. The administrator, a man named Kendall who'd run the hospital for 6 years without a single scandal, felt his stomach turn to concrete. At 0847, security entered room for 47. 2 officers in navy blue polo shirts, faces carefully neutral, the kind of neutrality that comes from having done this exact thing too many times. The SEAL's mother was holding his hand. His father stood at the window, watching rain streak the glass. The monitor beside the bed showed what Rachel's hands had created, a heart in normal sinus rhythm, blood pressure climbing toward something resembling stability, O2 saturation holding steady at 97%. Ms. Torres. Security Officer Number 1 spoke with the flat tone of someone reading from a script. You need to come with us. Your access has been revoked. Rachel didn't move at first. She looked at the monitor. The numbers were perfect. She looked at the SEAL's face, eyes still closed, but the muscles around them less tense than they'd been at 0300. She looked at his mother, whose expression had shifted from gratitude to confusion to a kind of dawning horror as the uniformed officers filled the doorway. Can I say goodbye to my patient? Rachel's voice was a whisper-thin thing, controlled as a surgical instrument. That won't be possible. Officer 2 stepped forward, already moving toward the door. You'll need to collect your belongings and exit the facility. Rachel removed her stethoscope from around her neck and set it on the bedside table with the same precision she'd used for every movement tonight. She'd been a corpsman. She understood silence and respect and the weight of what you left behind. The stethoscope lay there like a monument to decisions that couldn't be unmade. In the hallway, they handed her the box. She'd expected it. The moment it happened, she knew exactly what would be inside. The cracked mug from the base exchange at Camp Leatherneck, the one that had closed in 2014, the one she'd bought on her last day of leave before rotating back to Helmand. The dying succulent she'd kept in the corner of her locker, the one she'd watered twice a week for 6 months, the one she'd been slowly failing to save. And the photograph. The unit photo from March 2004, 12 faces arranged in 3 rows, half of them smiling, half of them with the 1,000-yard stare that comes from knowing you're running out of time. She knew every face. She knew every name. She knew which 8 of them had died. The rain started in earnest as she rode the elevator down. The fluorescent lights in the lobby seemed to buzz louder than they had 10 hours ago. The automatic doors slid open and hit her with the smell of wet concrete and diesel exhaust from the delivery trucks idling in the bay. She walked past the information desk where a volunteer in pink scrubs glanced up. Past the waiting room where a mother held a crying toddler. Past the chapel where no one was praying. The bus stop was 2 blocks south. She made it there in 8 minutes, her gait military precise despite the cardboard box already softening in her arms from the rain. The bench was full, a construction worker, an elderly woman with a shopping cart, a teenager with earbuds in. Rachel stood, holding the box, water running down her forearms, mixing with the sweat she'd accumulated over 12 hours of surgery and crisis and lies she'd told herself about who she could be. The box gave way around the corner. The bottom of the cardboard simply surrendered. The cracked mug fell through and shattered on the concrete with a sound like breaking glass, which was exactly what it was. The succulent tumbled into the gutter. The photograph, thank God for whatever instinct made her catch it, she grabbed before it could hit the ground. She knelt on the wet pavement. The rain hammered down like applause for a standing ovation she'd never wanted. Her hands, the same hands that had performed a pericardiocentesis at 02 for 5 hours, the same hands that had pulled shrapnel from an infant's abdomen under fire 18 years ago in a village clinic 3,000 miles away, her hands shook. Not from the cold. Not from the rain. From the sound of that mug breaking. From the realization that she'd finally felt useful again, that for exactly 12 hours she'd been exactly who she was meant to be, and they'd taken it away. She sat on the wet pavement, rain soaking through her scrubs, through her civilian clothes underneath, through the layers of armor she'd spent 3 years building. For the first time since she'd walked away from the Navy, she cried. Not quiet tears. Not the single tear of television drama. She sobbed, the kind of crying that comes from a place so deep you didn't know it existed until something broke you open. The photograph stayed dry in her hands. 12 faces. Helmand Province. March 2004. The eyes of the 7-year-old boy she'd carried out of that clinic under fire, the boy whose face she'd recognize anywhere, were not in this photo. But his mother's were. His father's were. The Marines who'd covered her extraction were. The ones who made it home. The ones who didn't. A woman at the bus stop looked away. The construction worker checked his phone. No one helped. No one asked. No one said anything. That was Oak Creek Memorial's gift to her, Rachel thought. That was what Hargrove had purchased with his phone calls and his consultant and his lies. The right to be invisible again, exactly as she'd wanted, except now the invisibility tasted like poison. Her phone buzzed against her hip. She pulled it out with trembling fingers. A news alert: controversy at Raleigh Hospital, nurse fired after emergency procedure saves veteran's life. There was her name. There was her face on the hospital security camera footage, perfectly clear, perfectly captured, performing a medical procedure in a room where she had no authority to be. The article was already online. The comments were already flowing. Some said she was a hero. Some said she was reckless. Some said she should be prosecuted. None of them knew that she'd been standing in a rain-soaked parking lot in Raleigh, North Carolina, holding a photograph of the dead, wondering if saving that boy's life twice, once as a Navy corpsman in a combat zone, once as a temp nurse in a hospital, had been worth the price of erasure. Her phone buzzed again. Then again. Then it started ringing. Unknown number. She didn't answer. Unknown number again. She still didn't answer. But the third call came from a number with a 703 area code, Arlington, Virginia, and something in her military spine remembered what Pentagon-adjacent phone numbers meant. She let it ring once more before she answered. Senior Chief Torres. A woman's voice, official cadence, the kind of authority that doesn't ask permission. This is Captain Maria Diaz with Naval Personnel Command. We need to talk about what happened at Oak Creek Memorial. Rachel's voice came out steady. I'm a civilian now, Captain. Not anymore, you aren't, Diaz said. Sit tight. We're sending someone to pick you up. The line went dead. Rachel sat on the wet pavement, holding a photograph of the dead and the living, and understood that anonymity, the thing she'd paid so much to purchase, had just become impossible to afford. The paralyzed SEAL woke at 9:32 a.m. on a Thursday morning to the sound of a television mounted in the corner of his room, volume low, anchors discussing a story about Oak Creek Memorial Hospital. His name was Marcus. 23 years old. The kind of young man who could no longer move below the chest, but whose eyes still tracked movement like a hunter's. He'd been staring at the ceiling for 3 days when the news segment started, and something in the reporter's tone made him turn his head toward the screen. A photograph appeared, a woman in hospital scrubs, dark hair pulled back, eyes that looked directly at the camera with the kind of steadiness that made most people look away first. The headline read, Nurse fired after saving veteran's life, hospital denies life-saving intervention. The reporter's voice carried the rehearsed concern of someone reading about a human interest story between segments on road construction and local tax increases. But Marcus wasn't listening to the reporter. He was looking at the woman's face, and something in his chest began to move, a sensation he hadn't felt since the blast that took his legs. Recognition. The kind that moves through neural pathways older than memory, older than language. Muscle tissue doesn't forget hands that have held it together while the world exploded around it. Marcus turned to the Navy liaison officer sitting in the chair beside his bed, a chief petty officer named Davies with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow and the kind of patience that comes from watching other people's wars end on screens. Marcus's voice came out thin from disuse. That woman. The nurse. I know her. Davies didn't move. You saw her picture on a hospital monitor, son. You don't know her. Marcus kept his eyes on the television. I need to tell you something. His hand, the only part of him that moved with any precision now, reached sideways and gripped the bed rail. In 2004, I was 7 years old. Sanjin Valley. There was a clinic, not really a clinic, just a building where a doctor from France tried to see patients. A mortar round hit the courtyard. I was there with my mother. Shrapnel took my abdomen open. Davies leaned forward slightly, his expression unchanging. The liaison officers had heard trauma stories from 100 enlisted personnel. But something in Marcus's breathing, the precision of the details, the way his eyes didn't blink, told Davies this wasn't rehearsed. There was a medevac, Marcus continued. American helicopter. They pulled me out, and there was a corpsman. Female. Hand steady like she was stitching fabric instead of a 7-year-old's intestines. Eyes calm. Talking to me in Pashto, I don't know how she knew Pashto, but she did. Telling me my mother was safe, telling me she had me, telling me to breathe. The helicopter was getting shot at. Rounds through the fuselage. And she never looked up from my stomach. Never flinched. Finished the field suture. Pushed morphine. Held my hand all the way to Kandahar. That woman on the television, that's the corpsman. That's the one who pulled me out. Davies didn't speak for 7 seconds. The liaison officer stood, walked to the door, and picked up his secure phone. His voice came out in the flat military cadence of someone reading coordinates to an airstrike. Sir, I need to escalate something. We have a positive identification on the nurse from the Oak Creek story. Patient recognizes her as a Navy medical personnel from a 2004 Helmand operation. I'm going to need you to contact Naval Criminal Investigative Service and Pentagon operations. He paused. Sir, the patient just whispered her call sign. Valkyrie. He said she was Valkyrie in the village. That was 20 years ago. The call lasted 90 seconds. Davies hung up and sat back down. He didn't explain anything to Marcus. He just nodded once and said, "You did the right thing, son. They're going to handle it from here." For hours and 17 minutes later, a file landed on the desk of Oak Creek Memorial's hospital administrator, Thomas Whitmore, a man whose phone had been ringing off the hook since dawn with board members and lawyers and someone from the state health department. The file was thick. Official seal on the envelope. Inside, Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, service record declassified for emergency credentialing review. 3 Navy Crosses. 2 Bronze Stars with combat distinguishing devices. A Purple Heart for a blast wound in Helmand Province that had shattered her left femur in 3 places. Another Purple Heart for a gunshot wound to the right shoulder, sustained while treating a casualty under direct fire. A commendation for the extraction of 12 wounded personnel from a surrounded outpost in Helmand Province on March 18, 2004, the outpost that took 47 rounds per minute for 6 hours straight. The file included photographs. Rachel in desert camouflage, maybe 26 years old, standing over a casualty with blood on her gloves and the kind of focus that made violence look like surgery. Rachel receiving a decoration from a 2-star general, her face neutral, her jaw tight. Rachel's final service record noting her medical discharge in 2006 for service-related PTSD and her explicit request that all future employers be told she was a former nurse, nothing more. The administrator read the file once, then read it again. By the time he finished, his hands were shaking because he understood, with the clarity that comes from hindsight, that he had allowed his hospital's chief of surgery to destroy a human being whose actual resume included preventing American soldiers from being buried in foreign soil. The next morning at 8:45 a.m., a SEAL team leader named Greeley walked into Thomas Whitmore's office without an appointment. Not a request. A command presence that made the administrator's administrative assistant, who had tried to stop him at the door, step sideways without being touched. Greeley was 43, built like someone who had thrown a man through a window before breakfast and wasn't particularly bothered by it. The scar tissue around his knuckles told stories that should have required warrants to hear. He sat in the chair across from the administrator's desk without being invited and placed a photograph on the desk. Rachel. Younger. In full dress whites, standing in formation with a SEAL platoon. That Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, Greeley said. His voice carried the rasp of someone who'd spent years issuing orders in environments where hesitation meant death. 3 Navy Crosses. Each one earned by refusing to abandon wounded. He placed another photo. 2 Bronze Stars for combat medical intervention. Another. 2 Purple Hearts. First, from a blast that should have killed her. Second, from taking fire while treating a casualty instead of seeking cover. In 2004, she coordinated the extraction of 12 wounded from forward operating base Shank in Helmand Province. 12. Out of an outpost that was being penetrated from 3 sides. She moved between gunfire positions, treating triage patients, and carried 2 of them on her shoulders because they couldn't walk. Greeley leaned back. Your hospital refused treatment to a paralyzed SEAL 15 times. 15 different physicians said no. And the one person at Oak Creek who tried to help him, the one person who actually gave a damn, was a decorated Navy medical professional. You fired her. For helping. And the Pentagon is sending investigators for every single one of those 15 doctors. The administrator tried to speak. Greeley didn't let him. That woman saved the life of a boy in 2004 who you just met again yesterday in a hospital bed. 20 years later. He recognized her voice on the news and made a phone call that led directly to my desk. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to reinstate her, with back pay and a formal apology. You're going to cooperate fully with federal investigators regarding Dr. David Hargrove's billing practices. And you're going to thank God that what she did in that village is why she didn't let you bury that SEAL in your hospital while you looked away. Greeley stood. Do we understand each other? At 3:20 p.m. that same afternoon, Dr. Hargrove sat at his desk with his hands shaking in the way that precedes survival or catastrophe. He had spent the morning making calls to board members, to consultants, to the nursing agency, painting Rachel as unstable, unqualified, insubordinate. By lunch, those same people had stopped answering his calls. By 2:33 p.m., he'd received an email from hospital legal informing him of a federal investigation into his billing practices spanning the last 9 years. 9 years. Phantom consultations. Procedures coded but never performed. Kickback arrangements with device manufacturers conducted in parking garages and hotel conference rooms. His hands moved to his computer keyboard before his mind caught up with the implications. He needed to delete the security footage. The footage of empty exam rooms. The footage of consultations with people who never existed. The footage of him reviewing Rachel's chart at 0315 hours and making the calculation that her competence was more dangerous than her obscurity. His fingers found the hospital security directory and logged in. Access denied. He tried again. Access denied. He tried a third time with his backup credentials. A voice came from his doorway. Looking for something, Doc? Ken Braddock, the IT administrator, a Marine Corps veteran with a scar tissue map of Fallujah written across his forearms, leaned against the door frame with his hands in his pockets. Hargrove tried the smile that had worked for 37 years. Routine quality review, Ken. Need to clear some storage space. Ken didn't return the smile. Funny thing. Got a call from a buddy at Naval Criminal Investigative Service about an hour ago. Asked me to preserve all security footage and billing records related to one Dr. Hargrove. Already forwarded everything to their secure server. You know, Doc, I did 2 tours in Fallujah. Lost 3 friends to IED blasts. And I just found out you turned away a paralyzed Navy SEAL 15 times, you and 14 other cowards. Hargrove tried to push past Ken toward the door. Ken didn't move. He was a wall. A wall that had spent years standing between chaos and civilians. Step back, Hargrove said. Not a request. Ken's expression didn't change. I need to go. Right now. You need to sit down, Ken said. Or I can have security sit you down. Choose. By 5:53 p.m., federal investigators in dark suits were arriving at Oak Creek Memorial with warrants, seizing computers and filing cabinets, taking statements from the quality assurance consultant who had suddenly decided he needed to be in Denver immediately. Hargrove's office was photographed. His billing records were documented. The parking lot where he'd conducted his private consultations with medical device representatives was being mapped for security footage from neighboring buildings. Board members who had taken his calls that morning, the ones where he described Rachel as a threat, were suddenly developing very detailed recollections of conversations they insisted they barely remembered. By 6:33 p.m., the lead hospital attorney called Hargrove into his office. 23 minutes of conversation. Suspension pending investigation. Retain private counsel immediately. Don't speak to staff, patients, or law enforcement without a lawyer present. Your medical license is likely to be referred to the state board. Federal charges are probable. The attorney's voice had the tone of someone explaining that someone else's life was over, clinical, not unkind, just factual. At 7:15 p.m., Hargrove drove to his lake house, the one paid for with 9 years of fraudulent billing, and found his wife zipping up suitcases in the master bedroom. "It's on the news, David." "Everything." She didn't make eye contact. She just kept packing. He tried to call the board chairman. Voicemail. He tried for other doctors in his professional network, the ones who'd sent him referrals, the ones who'd attended his summer parties, the ones who'd benefited from the consulting fees that were really just kickback. Distributions. None of them answered. By 9:48 p.m., news vans were pulling up to his house, reporters shouting questions toward his front door. Hargrove stood in his study, looking at his medical degree on the walnut wall, at the photographs from his graduation ceremony, at the letter of commendation from the hospital board from 15 years ago, and understood that every favor he'd called in to destroy Rachel had a timestamp, a witness, a paper trail that led directly back to his desk. The blinds closed in darkness. If you've ever been underestimated because of who people thought you were instead of who you actually are, Rachel's story is for you. This is the moment when the quiet person in the room stops being invisible. Hit subscribe to see what happens next, like this video if you believe that heroes walk among us in places we never expect to find them, and comment below, what would you have done if you were in Rachel's position? Would you have saved him, or would you have walked away like everyone else?